I never thought a quiet lake cabin could turn into a legal battlefield overnight. One minute, I was standing inside my own property, trying to keep a low profile, and the next, an HOA officer was forcing her way through the door like she owned the place. No warning, no permission, just accusations, threats, and a smug confidence that made my stomach drop. She didn't ask who I was meeting or why the lights were on inside a cabin that was supposed to be vacant. What she didn't realize was that this wasn't just a private visit, and that every step she took deeper inside would cost her far more than she ever imagined. So what happens when someone abuses power at the worst possible moment? Before everything went wrong, the lake cabin was supposed to be my quiet escape from noise, deadlines, and other people's expectations. It sat just far enough from the main road that you could hear water before you heard traffic, and at night the only lights that mattered were the reflections dancing off the surface of the lake. I didn't move there to make enemies or statements. I moved there to disappear for a while. The community itself was small and tightly managed, the kind of place where lawns looked identical and trash bins were lined up with military precision. Most of the neighbors were polite in the careful, distant way people are when rules matter more than relationships. They waved, smiled, and went back to their routines. Nobody lingered, nobody asked questions, and at first I liked it that way. The cabin wasn't flashy. It didn't tower over the others or break the skyline. It followed every guideline that mattered on paper. The paperwork was clean, the permits were approved, the taxes were paid. From the outside, there was nothing about my place that should have drawn attention. That was intentional. I wanted the kind of property that blended in, not the kind that sparked conversations at HOA meetings. My days followed a predictable rhythm. I'd arrive late in the evening, park quietly, and keep to myself. Sometimes I stayed alone, sometimes I hosted a small meeting, always discreet, always respectful of the community's so-called standards. No loud music, no extra cars spilling onto the street, nothing that honestly could justify a complaint. If someone had been watching, all they would have seen was someone minding their own business. But even in peaceful neighborhoods, there's always someone watching too closely. It started with small signs I almost ignored. A notice taped crookedly to my door, reminding residents about unauthorized usage hours, a neighbor who stopped waving back, a slow drive-by that lingered just a second too long. None of it was serious enough to confront, but together it felt like the air had shifted, like someone had decided I didn't belong, even though I'd done everything by the book. The HOA had a reputation. Everyone knew it, even if no one talked about it openly. They enforced rules aggressively, often selectively. Some residents got warnings, others got fines, and a few, the unlucky ones, became examples. People whispered about surprise inspections, creative interpretations of bylaws, and officers who treated authority like a personal weapon. Still, I assumed staying compliant would keep me invisible. That assumption didn't last long. One evening, I noticed a car parked across the street with the engine running and the lights off. Another night, someone tried the cabin door handle before quickly walking away. Then came the emails, vague, stern messages about ongoing concerns and potential violations, without naming anything specific. Each message felt less like communication and more like a warning shot. What bothered me most wasn't the pressure, it was the confidence behind it. Whoever was pushing this seemed absolutely certain they could walk into my space and question my right to be there. They weren't asking, they were preparing. I kept my routine unchanged even as the tension thickened. There was a meeting scheduled inside the cabin that week, quiet, professional, and completely legitimate, the kind of meeting that required privacy, not confrontation. I assumed the HOA would do what they always did, send another email, maybe issue a fine, then move on. Instead, they chose a different approach. By the time the knock came, it was clear this wasn't about rules anymore. It was about power. And whoever was standing on the other side of that door believed, without hesitation, it belonged to them.
The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly,
like fog rolling off the lake, thickening a little more each day until it was impossible to ignore. The first fine showed up in my inbox early one morning, buried under neutral language and polite formatting. It cited unauthorized occupancy patterns and demanded immediate correction. No explanation, no reference to any specific rule I'd broken, just a number at the bottom and a deadline circled in red. I read it twice, then a third time, trying to understand how simply existing in my own cabin had become a violation. I responded calmly, attaching copies of my permits and usage approvals. The reply came back within minutes, too fast to be reviewed properly. It thanked me for my input and informed me the fine would remain in place pending further inspection. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a decision. From there, things escalated fast. I started finding violation notices taped to my door instead of emailed, as if someone wanted to make sure the entire neighborhood could see them. One claimed my exterior lights were too bright. Another said they were too dim. One accused me of running a commercial operation. The next accused me of leaving the property unattended, even though my car was parked out front. Each notice contradicted the last, but all carried the same message: comply or else. The inspections followed. They never announced themselves ahead of time. I'd come back to the cabin and notice disturbed gravel, footprints near the windows, a gate left unlatched. Once I found chalk marks near the foundation, as if someone had been measuring or documenting something. When I confronted the HOA office, they denied everything, while reminding me that common area oversight was allowed under their bylaws. It felt like a loophole big enough to walk through my front door. Neighbors began to pull away. People who once nodded politely now avoided eye contact. A couple whispered when I walked past. Someone posted anonymously on the community board about outsiders abusing lake properties. No names were mentioned, but I knew exactly who it was aimed at. The HOA didn't discourage it. If anything, they let the rumors do the work for them. Then came the real threat. An official letter arrived stating the HOA was considering temporary access enforcement due to repeated violations. The phrasing was careful, almost elegant, but the meaning was clear. They believed they had the right to enter my property without consent. I sat at the kitchen table, reading it, while the lake shimmered calmly outside, the contrast almost mocking. Everything inside me tightened. I pushed back harder. I sent formal responses. I requested specific bylaw references. I asked for hearings, documentation, timelines. Each request was either ignored or answered with vague authority. The fines doubled. Late fees appeared on charges I was actively disputing. It became a financial pressure campaign designed to exhaust me into submission. What unsettled me most was the confidence behind it all. The HOA officer spearheading this, everyone knew who she was, carried herself like someone untouchable. She spoke in absolutes. She referenced rules without producing them. And every time we crossed paths, she wore the same expression: satisfaction mixed with impatience, as if she was waiting for me to realize resistance was pointless. One afternoon, I caught her standing near my cabin, clipboard in hand, peering through a window. When she noticed me, she didn't flinch, she didn't apologize. She simply smiled and reminded me that compliance is easier than conflict. The way she said it sent a chill through me. The emails grew more aggressive, the notices more frequent. One evening, I received 3 separate violations within the span of an hour. It was clear they were stacking charges, building a case that would justify something bigger, something final. And then the warnings started turning into predictions. An email subject line read, "Final opportunity to cooperate." Another suggested that forced corrective action might be necessary if the situation continued. They spoke as if the outcome was already decided, as if my role in all of this was just to stand still while they closed in. Despite everything, I kept the meeting scheduled. It was important, it was legitimate, and it was the one thing the HOA didn't know the details of.
I assumed, maybe foolishly, that even they wouldn't cross the line of entering an occupied private residence. No matter how aggressive they were, there had to be a boundary. The night of the meeting, the air felt heavier than usual. The lake was still, no wind, no sound. I noticed a car idling near the entrance of the property longer than necessary before driving off. My phone buzzed with another HOA message I didn't open. Inside the cabin, everything was calm, professional, normal. For a brief moment, it felt like the world outside had paused. Then came the knock. It wasn't tentative, it wasn't polite, it was sharp, authoritative, and relentless. Before I could even reach the door, I heard keys jingle, a lock turned, the handle moved. Someone on the other side believed they had the right to come in. As the door began to open, it became clear that this wasn't just another warning or fine. This was the culmination of weeks of pressure, a test of power taken too far. And whoever was stepping inside had no idea they were about to walk into a situation that would change everything, for them and for the HOA.
The door opened wider than it should have. What followed wasn't a pause or a moment of hesitation. It was certainty. Unchecked, arrogant certainty, walking straight into a space it had no right to enter. The HOA officer stepped inside as if the cabin were already hers, her confidence fueled by weeks of intimidation, fines, and silence from anyone who should have stopped her. This was the moment she'd been building toward, the moment she believed would end everything. Inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The calm that had filled the cabin moments earlier didn't disappear, it hardened. Papers were laid out neatly on the table. Phones were face down but recording, the kind of quiet that follows preparation, not fear. The HOA officer scanned the room, expecting to find violations, proof of wrongdoing, leverage. Instead, she found something far more dangerous: witnesses. She didn't recognize them at first. Her momentum slowed, her steps hesitated. The smug authority she'd carried in dissolved into confusion as her eyes moved from one face to another. This wasn't a homeowner scrambling to explain himself. This wasn't a tenant caught breaking rules. This was a controlled environment, and she was the only one who hadn't been invited. That was when the realization hit her. The meeting she had barged into wasn't private in the way she'd assumed. It wasn't secretive or questionable. It was official, legal, documented. The kind of meeting that doesn't end quietly when interrupted, but starts an entirely new chapter. The shift in power was immediate and unmistakable. Every claim she'd made over the past weeks collapsed under its own weight. The emergency access justification had no basis. The fines had no consistent documentation. The inspections were unauthorized. The surveillance, the intimidation, the attempt to force entry, it was all suddenly exposed, not as enforcement, but as abuse. And the most devastating part wasn't that she was wrong. It was that she was wrong in front of the worst possible people. As the scope of her actions became clear, the confidence drained from her posture. The clipboard that once symbolized authority now looked absurd. Her presence wasn't commanding anymore. It was incriminating. Every step she had taken inside that cabin had crossed a legal boundary she couldn't undo. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that the person seated across the room wasn't just a witness. It was the state attorney general. Not observing from a distance, not hearing a report secondhand, but present, watching, experiencing the violation in real time. The exact kind of scenario that turns small, petty power plays into statewide consequences. The room didn't erupt. There was no shouting, no dramatic theatrics. That would have been too easy. Instead, the weight of the moment pressed down slowly, crushing every assumption she'd relied on. The laws she had twisted now being read correctly. The authority she pretended to wield was now being measured against the real thing. And it didn't compare. Documentation was reviewed, timelines were clarified, patterns emerged. This wasn't a one-time mistake, it was a campaign.
selective enforcement, targeted harassment. An HOA officer who had grown comfortable operating without oversight, convinced no one would challenge her. She had chosen the wrong door to open. Outside, a few neighbors had gathered, drawn by the unusual activity. They watched as the confidence they'd seen for months finally cracked. The same officer who had once posted notices publicly and threatened homeowners now stood exposed, her authority stripped away piece by piece. This wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about every resident who'd paid fines without question, every homeowner who'd backed down to avoid conflict, every person who'd been made to feel small by rules that shifted depending on who was enforcing them. And now it was all on record. By the time law enforcement arrived, not for the homeowner, but for the situation itself, the narrative had fully reversed. The invasion of property, the unauthorized entry, the misuse of HOA bylaws, none of it could be spun away or buried under procedural language. The officer was escorted out the same way she'd entered, only this time without authority, without confidence, and without the illusion of control. As the door closed behind her, the silence that followed wasn't tense, it was final. But the real shock wasn't what had just happened inside the cabin. It was what was about to happen next, when the consequences of that single step across the threshold would ripple far beyond the lake, the neighborhood, and the HOA itself.
The fallout didn't happen overnight, but it began the moment that door closed. What unfolded in the days that followed felt surreal compared to the weeks of pressure that came before. The fines stopped first. No more emails filled with vague threats, no more notices taped to the door. The silence from the HOA was sudden and absolute, like an engine that had seized after being pushed too hard for too long. Then came the formal actions. An external investigation was opened into the HOA's enforcement practices, not just regarding my property, but across the entire community. Records were subpoenaed, internal communications were reviewed. Patterns that residents had only whispered about were now laid out clearly, backed by timelines and documentation. What many had suspected for years was finally undeniable. Rules weren't being enforced to maintain order, they were being used to exert control. The officer who had forced her way into my cabin was removed from her position within weeks. Not quietly reassigned, not allowed to resign with dignity, she was formally dismissed, her authority revoked, her actions cited as a direct violation of both state law and homeowners' rights. The same confidence that once powered her intimidation campaign had cost her everything. But it didn't stop with her. The HOA itself was placed under oversight. Several board members stepped down as scrutiny intensified. Long-standing policies were suspended pending review. New rules were introduced requiring transparency, documented inspections, and homeowner consent. For the first time, residents were allowed to attend meetings without intimidation, to ask questions without fear of retaliation. People started talking openly. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to share their own stories. Excessive fines, selective enforcement, quiet threats that forced them into compliance. Many had paid simply to make the stress go away. Others had sold their homes to escape it entirely. Seeing someone finally push back and win changed the atmosphere of the entire neighborhood. As for the cabin, it returned to what it was always meant to be: quiet, private, mine. The lake looked the same, but the air felt different, lighter. The tension that once clung to every visit had lifted. I no longer felt watched or measured. For the first time in months, I could sit inside my own property without anticipating a knock, a notice, or a threat disguised as policy. The meeting that night, the one that sparked everything, had served its purpose in a way none of us could have predicted. What was meant to be private had become pivotal. A line had been crossed so clearly that it forced accountability where years of complaints had failed. That was the real impact. Not revenge, not humiliation, accountability. HOAs exist to manage communities, not dominate them. Rules are meant to protect shared spaces, not invade private ones. Authority without oversight always drifts toward abuse, especially when no one believes they can challenge it. That belief that resistance is pointless is what keeps power unchecked until someone refuses to back down. What struck me most wasn't how quickly things changed once the truth was exposed. It was how long they'd stayed the same because no one had been in the right position at the right time to witness it. All it took was one moment of overreach, one assumption too many, for the entire structure to crack. The HOA officer thought she was enforcing rules. Instead, she exposed a system that had forgotten its limits. And that's the lesson that lingers long after the paperwork is filed and the headlines fade. Power depends on boundaries. The moment someone decides those boundaries don't apply to them, they create the very evidence that will eventually bring them down. So if there's one takeaway from all of this, it's simple. Knowing your rights matters, but timing, witnesses, and preparation matter just as much. Abuse of authority thrives in silence, but it collapses under scrutiny. All it takes is one door opened at the wrong time and the courage to stand your ground when it does.